Welcome everyone to the Lofi Poli Sci podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pickering. That's right, Lo-Fi as in low fidelity, low quality, in your face, messy as can be global news show. Here we're going to talk about that famous question, what's going on in the world today? And we're not talking about it all by our lonesome. Oh, no, not today. We are happy as can be to bring back none other than the famous, the wonderful, the talented Dr. Robert Worth, political scientist extraordinaire from the University of New Orleans. Dr. Worth, how have you been lately, my friend?
Man, I've been a lot better than I was last time we talked because, the world's getting better by the day. Got a long way to go, obviously, but for me, starting to see some shreds of optimism. But I'll quickly temper that by saying I went to the grocery store earlier today and was kind of sad about this beautiful weather because summer heat is right around the corner.
Oh, that's right. Summer's in New Orleans, hot and sticky, icky, smelly hot. Ooh, we do not love it at all, but thank goodness for the air conditioner.
You're right.
Well, thank you so much for coming back on the show with us today, my friend. And today we're talking about three very specific topics that you may have heard about before, listeners out there. Number one, the Suez Canal being blocked by a massive ship, causing all kinds of traffic on the seven seas, or at least one of them. And number two, post COVID-19 global trade. As more and more vaccines are spread across the world, it's important to think about the international economy moving forward. And number three, our final topic of the day, the International Monetary Fund, aka the IMF, having a new deal for developing countries and what that means for the majority of the planet. And let's jump into it, Dr. Worth. Tell us, what's the deal with this massive ship blocking the Suez Canal and why we're even talking about it?
As we all know, and it seems like it's been so long ago given the elasticity of time in this weird moment, but basically a giant container ship blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days. And this is a big deal because about 10% of all global goods that are traded pass through the canal, about 7% of global oil. You don't have to use the canal. This is typically used when going from Asia to Europe for these container ships and oil tankers. You can go around Africa in the Cape of Good Hope, but that adds about 10 days to the trip. That's about 30% of the total. So, as the cliche goes, time is money. And so, what I found really interesting about this from the perspective of New Orleans is those of us here, we go down to the river and we see these giant container ships, or they look pretty giant to me, going up and down the river. So I did a little bit of Googling. The Ever Given, the ship that blocked the Suez, it can carry 20,000 of these containers. The largest container ship to ever dock at the port of New Orleans could carry only 9,500. So that certainly put it in perspective for me that this was a big ship.
That's incredible to really think about that. The Ever Given is more than double the size of any ship that we see here in New Orleans, because New Orleans, the Mississippi River is the fourth longest river in the world. It's massive. And if you go anywhere in the city and you're sitting on the levee and you're watching these massive shipping containers go by, the enormity of them is just amazing. But to think something double the size blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days, as you said. But but still, I have to wonder. I'm like, and you already said, a large percentage of our goods go through the canal. But why should we even still be talking about this? It's already finished, right? It's already been taken care of. What's the big deal?
On the one hand, it's not a big deal. It's more than nothing, obviously, but the global economy can handle that kind of hiccup. I would imagine we're not even going to sort of see a blip in the data. But as a symbol globalizing economy, I think that's why we've kind of latched onto it because these ships are getting bigger and bigger. Globalization, despite recent setbacks, if we want to phrase it that way, has been continuing apace, but it definitely sort of represents a lot of the anxiety surrounding globalism. These days, I think less so about labor and more the fragility of these supply chains that we rely on. We certainly China's been putting a digital boycott on H&M. Biden is very concerned about our semiconductor shortage. He's doing a security review of those and our other supply chains. And so, yeah, my take is, why are we still talking about this? Well, because it symbolizes a lot of other things that we've been talking about.
I completely agree with you. And I think it's super interesting how we as human beings, we're flying to space. We're going to the moon, we're sending rovers to Mars. And yet, most of our goods here on Earth are still sent via boats. And I think you're absolutely right. This does symbolize a whole lot of other issues that are extremely relevant. And in particular, even jumping into our next one, the post COVID-19 global trade, aka the international economy. Dr. Worth, what are we talking about here? And what does post global trade look like for after COVID-19?
That's the big question. We all like to prognosticate, but none of us prognosticated COVID-19 happening in the first place. I suppose certain epidemiologists did, but you and I didn't, that's for sure. And so, yeah, what are things going to look like in terms of trade afterward? Different. We can probably assume that much. Different in what way gets a little more complicated, because tying it in with the Suez issue, certainly as we know, China is trying to rewrite a lot of the rules, including something directly related to shipping with its increasingly expansive claims in the South China Sea. It's increasingly, in my opinion, creative interpretation of the law of the sea as it applies in these sorts of situations. And so, yeah, my money is on a rising China trying to reconfigure rules and institutions to its benefit, and all of that probably being accelerated by the disruption of COVID. We tend to have inertia when it comes to things like international institutions. Maybe this is an external shock that's going to increase or accelerate, I should say, these changes. But I'm necessarily cautious in those predictions.
I feel you. I feel you. And you bring up the South China Sea, and I agree. Just last month and before, we got news that over 200 Chinese quote unquote fishing vessels strapped up together right off of the Philippines. And the Philippines' response was, we don't like this. We're going to put forth an international complaint. But even Duterte in the past, President Duterte of the Philippines has said, look, there is not much we can do about this. If we were to go to war theoretically with China over this, we would lose. There is no way we can do anything about it. So you're right, without an international coalition to do something about the South China Sea conflict, it just continues where China's influence expands. And I think that's incredible. And I think you are right that one potential answer is that after everything with COVID is finished, things could go back to the way they were before, so much as China was expanding before COVID. So that could continue after this. But it's not the only option out there. It could very well be that Western institutions and Western countries, the United States, the UK, France, Germany, and so many others, band together to push back against China. And in particular, we have seen this happening lately with the US and other Western countries putting sanctions on China over human rights violations with the Uyghur population, right?
Yeah, without a doubt. And what's interesting about it, kind of playing off of that, in my opinion, China is without question your textbook revisionist state. They're increasing in power. They're increasingly able to challenge the existing global order, but they don't want to scrap it entirely. China likes trade. China likes globalization. It's how it became the powerful country that it is today. And two, I think COVID has exposed for the US that maybe the existing order, if on balance we like it, we created it. The fact that a country as rich and powerful as the United States couldn't get surgical masks when it wanted them. That alone, such a seemingly simple product to try and acquire, even the United States under the current system for very, a long time, once COVID hit, wasn't able to do so. And so perhaps my hope is that the US wants to revise things. Its allies presumably feel similarly. China wants to revise things. while the idea of what that revision should look like is presumably going to be very different, the fact that neither is as entrenched in the status quo as perhaps they were prior to COVID, maybe we'll get, cooperation, standard sort of liberalism 101, positive sum outcomes. That's my hope.
Yeah, I think that is one possibility for sure. But I think at the same time, we're also looking at it as a very narrow playing field because I think we also need to consider, well, what about Russia and the West right now? Because there is a whole lot of tension going on there, not just dealing with Ukraine. I mean, still some left over with Crimea and human rights as well, as far as Alexei Navalny and political prisoners. I mean, so if you put China by itself, that's one thing. If you put China and Russia together, that's a whole different ballgame. And then if you put China and Russia together, plus all of the other countries that are teaming up with China in China's One Belt, One Road initiative to build infrastructure by land, air, and sea to connect mass trade routes throughout all of Southeast Asia, Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, Europe. I mean, it looks like they're setting up the game to be way, way in their favor.
I could not agree more. And much as, we basically just sort of gave up on Syria and said, sure, Russia, that can be, your sphere of influence. It's not worth it to us. By my read, we're very much doing the same thing, very much so in Africa, to a lesser but still degree that I find problematic in Southeast Asia. And so, yeah, I could not agree more that um, I'll put it this way: for the longest time, I was very contrarian within our field in the sense that I just didn't buy it that once China got wealthy, they would become a liberal democracy and, sort of be quote unquote like us. And as a result, like the world that we've set up. Well, now I just don't see how anyone can really argue that that's going to be the case. And yet, our policymakers have been very slow to respond to that reality. So I agree with you. China is on the move and they're going to have a say going forward no matter what. It looks like they're going to have a much larger say than maybe a lot of people expected just a few years ago.
Yeah, I think that is quite the case. But also at the same time, there is one other option out there that we haven't talked about. So one is that, China just keeps getting bigger. Two is that Western influence and Western sanctions has a direct effect to where it keeps the West relevant as the, if you want to put all the West together as the hegemon of the world, that way the West can gain more influence. That would be our second option. But our third option is we're still in the thick of all of this. And at this moment in time, because the 19 is far from over, I mean, record breaking numbers of cases and deaths in India right now, largest democracy in the world. COVID-19 is still very much happening everywhere. There's a potential that there's simply too much noise in the data right now to predict anything where international trade or the global economy will go, in the long term, much less the short term. Where do you come down on this? Do you think leaning more towards China, leaning more towards the West, or leaning more towards there's too much noise in the data right now?
Of the three, in the short to medium term, without question, too much noise in the data, because again, nobody alive has ever dealt with anything even remotely like this before. And so it's easy to get ahead of ourselves in real time and try to make these predictions. But yeah, humility is without question the order of the day. My overall prediction is that nobody's turning their back on globalism. Nobody's turning their back on trade as a component of globalism, including China. And yet, I have a feeling that as we do, right, sort of expansive globalized trade and the associated rules and institutions, they kind of ebb and flow. They kind of ebbed following the financial crisis because some of the potential downsides became you couldn't ignore them, right? We're facing some of the downsides now. And what I just find really remarkable is that Trump, as we know, started a trade war with China He was a kind of stubbornly zero sum sort of guy in ways that I didn't frankly understand, but whatever. Biden hasn't really undone much of his trade war stuff. He's very kind of quietly let most of it continue. And so my takeaway with all of that is that we're kind of bumping up yet again against the limits of globalism, because one thing that's always intrigued me, globalized nature of trade in goods and services is unprecedented as a percentage of the world economy today, but not in a sort of categorically different way than other moments in history. The globalization of finance is truly unprecedented in all of human history. We've never seen anything even remotely like this. And yet, the globalization of labor isn't that much different than it's ever been, right? The rate of migration in the world is not, it's been pretty steady since World War II. And so, my prediction is we're bumping up against the reality that you can globalize goods and services, you can globalize finance, but if you don't globalize labor, you're not going to capture as much of the gains as you could have. COVID has obviously had some very big implications for migration and our policymakers' attitudes going forward. So it's a little bit long winded. It's a little bit convoluted because we are dancing around the noise. But that's my guess, that we're bumping up against the limits of globalization again. This time, the lack of globalized labor, I think, is going to be the big issue.
I like it. I like it a lot. Projections of the future of the global economy really is a hot topic today because everyone wants to know where we're going. And a lot of people are saying question mark. I wouldn't mind us coming back to this topic in about 6 months to see where our thoughts are then. Yeah, but now for our third and final topic of the day, the International Monetary Fund, aka the IMF, having a new deal for developing countries and what it means for the majority of the planet. Dr. Worth, please give us the DL on what's going on here.
So, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, they've got a proposal to increase their special drawing rights by about 650 billion. Now, the IMF and special drawing rights and all the rest of it, we could be here a very, 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 very long time and still not even scratch the surface. So, for our purposes, I think what's important here is that special drawing rights are a basket of very stable currencies: the euro, the pound sterling, renminbi, the yen, and the US dollar. And the idea is that this is a super stable, super liquid store of wealth. If you wanted to make a bad joke that I'm probably way too proud of, this is a really stable, liquid source of wealth, store of wealth. You might even call it the gold standard. Yeah, I see what I did there. But joking notwithstanding, it's not the gold standard. It's floating currencies on the international market, which is why we have this thing in the first place. The relevance for developing countries here is that they can draw on their special drawing rights in order to basically increase their foreign currency reserves, which, amongst many other things, gives them greater monetary policy at home, arguably greater fiscal policy, or I should say flexibility with monetary and fiscal policy, because it makes it easier for them to borrow internationally and it makes it cheaper for them to borrow internationally. And so this is the IMF basically trying to help out these countries with liquidity and with spending as they navigate the COVID crisis. One last important thing about the SDRs, the special drawing rights, is they're not subject to the same conditions that structural adjustments are subject to. Basically, when you draw on your SDRs, the IMF doesn't give you a list of things, of reforms that you've got to institute at home. So they're more attractive to countries, they're quicker, they're easier. It doesn't harm your international reputation as much, because if you get a structural adjustment loan, that's just a complicated way of saying your economy is in crisis. That spooks people, that cuts off access to liquidity and borrowing. Not nearly as much the case with SDRs. So I think for our purposes, that's what's relevant in this instance.
Well, I'm glad you brought up, the comparison to structural adjustment programs. These were really popular after the Cold War, where Western institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and Western countries would give loans to developing countries, but require them to liberalize their economy, open up their markets, democratize their country. And they were mostly unsuccessful, and caused a lot of devastation in developing countries. So the idea that these SDRs, no strings attached, sounds pretty good. Though my question is, what's been the reaction from developing countries to this announcement?
To date, I think the reaction has been fairly muted. It's really telling that the IMF put together quite a few other, let's call it emergency measures in response to COVID, in which there are just all sorts of, we don't really need to get into the details, I don't think, but all sorts of ways for them to very quickly and easily access foreign currency. In some instances, the response has been literally nothing since that one of these short-term emergency programs, at least as of a few weeks ago, no country had accessed it in any shape, form, or fashion. Here too, we've got the IMF, this kind of old school post-war liberal institution. As you point out, the United States used it to, let's call it, sort of force the Washington consensus down a lot of developing countries' throats. This may signal that it's not as relevant as it once was. Getting back to China, it's a different institution, but it's sort of boxing out the World Bank by saying, here's development money, and we won't attach all of these strings to it. In the case of the United States, we've been doing via the Federal Reserve a dollar swap program where we swap dollars for a country's own currency. They get the dollars, they do whatever they need to do with them. We agree to hold the currency for a specific amount of time so that it doesn't affect the value of their currency while they navigate the crisis. That's easier, that's simpler, it's more transparent than a lot of the IMF stuff. So, again, we don't want to sort of view our crystal ball as being more accurate than it really is. But in my opinion, this doesn't do anything to sort of bolster the legitimacy and the leverage of the IMF.
And that's interesting because, being a comparativist and particularly focusing on developing countries around the world, developing countries are always looking for a good source of aid, regardless of what type of aid it is. But the ability to draw on these SDRs, to have a stable currency, fixed rates, no conditions applied, to where you have greater control of your own budget at home, to me, that would be like optimal thing to do. And yet, we're like you said, the response is pretty muted to this. And I'm curious if, and I don't think there's a way either of us can answer this question, but if we're not just, or rather, we're just not hearing about the responses because the news cycle is so fast right now. Everything is so COVID focused. Everything is big topics. Could it be that developing countries are actually taking advantage of this, just we're not really hearing about it, or that developing countries themselves are not really hearing about it?
I think it's a really good question. And it yet again underscores one of the issues with the IMF, in a lot of people's opinions, is it's so complicated, it's so opaque, right? It's really difficult for the layperson or academics like ourselves to get real time information about what's going on with the IMF because the media, this is not the sort of thing that they're going to cover. It's too technical, it's too wonky. As you said, right, the news cycle right now, I mean, how can anyone keep up with anything? So, yeah, I think it's a fair question that I can't venture an answer to. Maybe this has been taken up more than I am aware of. Maybe, like you say, the IMF getting kind of crowded out. If it did a better job of promoting itself, maybe these special drawing rights would be used more aggressively. But I think the one takeaway is it highlights one of the issues with the IMF. A lot of people say it's a kind of old, creaky institution that hasn't kept up with the changing world. Whether or not that's the case, the difficulty accessing information and figuring out what's going on does nothing to help their case in that
Yeah, that's absolutely the truth. And I will definitely be looking to keep up with this moving forward because, like I said, as a comparativist and someone who's concerned about developing countries, this should be a hot topic. So I'll definitely be looking to see what's going on in the world tomorrow.
Right. And one last thought about that, it speaks volumes that, the IMF and so many of these other institutions have come under fire since their inception for benefiting the rich world or the West more so than the developing world. Whether or not that's true, a different conversation, but it's worth noting that of the proposed increase in special drawing rights, about half of the new liquidity would go to the United States, the EU, and the UK. And so
Uh,
that alone, make of that what you will, you know.
that's depressing for so many reasons. But I refuse to end on such a sad note. No, 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 no. Before you go, Dr. Worth, you and I are going to start a new thing for co-hosts that come on the show. We're going to end
Uh-oh.
with a rapid fire quiz question segment. That's right. I'm going to come at you with 5 fast-paced questions, and you get 5 seconds to answer each. Dr. Worth, are you ready?
I am trepidatiously eager.
Oh, I like that word, trepidatiously. Yes, yes, yes. Well, question number 1 coming at you. Is the Earth flat?
In the Thomas Friedman globalized sense of the word, less than it was 5 years
All right. I'll take that as a correct answer. Question number 2. Are penguins better than polar bears?
ago. Without question.
Oh, I don't know if I could support that answer, but I'll take it as correct for the time being. Question number 3. Is Pluto a planet or a dwarf planet?
Pluto is a planet. I'm frankly slightly offended by the question.
Oh, you truly are Lofi Poli Sci, sir. Question number 4. Are there 4 oceans or 5 oceans on planet Earth today?
4.5. The Arctic isn't an ocean yet, but it's getting there fast.
Ooh, interesting. In between the lines, I do somewhat lean towards there is only one ocean, but I like 4.5 just as well. So check mark on that. And question number 5, the big one for the day. What's the only self-governing autonomous region in the world that's ruled by emperors of the most majestic and graceful kind that makes all monarchies look like mockeries?
Okay. I will admit to being stumped by this one.
Oh, come now, think about it, think about it. An autonomous region in the world, a big region, ruled by emperors that are majestic, as in many, many emperors, and they are wonderful creatures. Come on now.
Okay. Antarctica.
That is absolutely right, because
All
Antarctica
right.
is a self-governing autonomous region declared by the United Nations. No one can step foot on there without permission by them, and it's only for scientific purposes. And we do love our penguins. Yes, we do. Thank you for playing Dr. Worth. And truly, Dr. Worth, thank you so much for coming on. And please do come back to us soon.
Yeah. Thank you as always. Always educational, challenging, and above all else, a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you again, my friend. And to everyone out there, that's a brief snapshot of what's going on in the world today. Letters of the Lofi Poli Sci issue 3 came out Saturday. Get at me for access. Do you have top 10 list ideas? Send them on in. Do you have good news to share? Share it with us. Interested in being a co-host? Interested in a flashcast, live stream, episode takeovers? Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Peace and well-being to all my human beings out there. Much love and always the best. Pickering, signing off.